All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're grabbing our magnifying glasses and doing some serious historical detective work on one of the most passionate, fiery letters ever written. We're going to see if a document that's nearly 2,000 years old still has fingerprints on it, clues that prove it's the real deal.
So how do you actually do that? How do you prove a letter from the ancient world is legit? Well, you could look for the obvious stuff, sure, but the really convincing clues? They're often the things the writer didn't even mean to leave behind. We're talking subtle details, little accidental connections, and yeah, even some weird inconsistencies that point to the messy, complicated truth of real history.
The letter we're putting under the microscope is the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Galatians, and our guide on this investigation is the brilliant 18th century thinker William Paley. We're jumping straight into the nitty-gritty of his book, Horæ Paulinæ, to look at the hidden evidence he found connecting this letter to the historical account in the Acts of the Apostles.
Okay, so Paley's first piece of evidence is fascinating because it's not about what the letter says, but how it says it. He argues that the very tone of Galatians is a massive clue to its authenticity. You can just feel it, right? Paul doesn't start with "Dear Galatians, hope you're well." He launches right in with shock and, frankly, indignation. He's obviously writing right in the middle of a massive crisis, responding to a direct attack on his work and his followers. Paley's point is, this is incredibly hard to fake. A forger is careful, they're calculating. This letter, it's a raw, emotional gut punch.
So here's the core idea. This letter just doesn't make any sense unless there was a real high-stakes fight going on. It's defensive, it's angry, it's deeply personal. Think about it. If you're a forger trying to push a particular idea, you'd write a nice, clean essay, right? Not this messy, personal drama. The passion itself is a sign that it's real.
Next up, Paley shifts gears from the letter's tone to its substance. He starts comparing the details of Paul's life in Galatians with the completely separate account we get in the Acts of the Apostles. And this is where the real detective work begins.
First, we get a nice, clean match. In Galatians, Paul admits he, beyond measure, persecuted the church. Over in Acts, the historian Luke writes that Saul made havoc of the church. So, check. Both sources, written by different people at different times, agree on this basic, crucial fact. Paul started out as a violent enemy of the very movement he would end up leading.
But now it gets really interesting, because the most powerful clues are sometimes the differences. In Galatians, Paul says that right after his conversion, he went off to Arabia for a bit, before eventually heading to Jerusalem. But then you look at the account in Acts, and there is zero mention of Arabia. Nothing. It's like the author of Acts never even heard about that trip.
And this is the genius of Paley's insight. This missing trip to Arabia is actually evidence for the letter's authenticity, not against it. Why? Because a forger who is basing Galatians on the book of Acts would never just invent a trip that wasn't in his source material. And vice versa. The discrepancy shows the two writers weren't cheating off each other. They're independent witnesses, just like you'd expect in a real case. And this idea, this principle of independence, it gets even clearer when Paley brings other key players into the investigation, guys like the apostles Peter and James and Paul's travel buddy Barnabas.
I mean, wow. This is one of the most shocking lines in the entire New Testament. Paul is describing a public showdown with Peter, the leader of the apostles, in the major city of Antioch. And he says flat out, "I withstood him to the face." He called him out for everyone to see.
And guess what? This huge event, this public clash between the two most important leaders in the early church, is completely, totally absent from the book of Acts. Gone. For a historian writing about the church's growth, you'd think this would be a pretty big deal to include.
And that brings us to Paley's killer question. Why on earth would a forger invent a story this embarrassing? A story that makes the heroes of the faith look divided and flawed? It just doesn't make any sense if you're trying to create a polished, authoritative fake. But if you're remembering a real, messy, human moment, it makes perfect sense. All right, for the final category of evidence, Paley zeroes in on the really subtle stuff, these thematic connections that are so casual and indirect, a forger would almost certainly miss them.
So in Galatians, Paul makes a specific accusation. He says the real motive of his opponents, the ones stirring up all this trouble, is that they're afraid of persecution. They're trying to blend in and appease the authorities to stay out of trouble. So that raises a question. Was persecution a big theme in Paul's ministry?
And you know what? When Paley flips back to the book of Acts, he finds this incredible pattern. The background noise in Galatians perfectly matches the main story in Acts. In city after city, it's the same story. Paul preaches, and local Jewish leaders stir up opposition that leads to persecution. It's not a direct copy-paste. It's a deep underlying consistency between two separate documents.
So after we've looked at the tone, the historical overlaps, the really important differences, and these subtle little connections, what's the final verdict on the epistle to the Galatians?
See, the case Paley builds isn't about one single knockout punch. It's cumulative. It's about how all these little pieces click together. Any one clue, the angry tone, the fight with Peter, you might be able to explain it away. But when you put them all together, you get this web of interlocking details where the letter agrees with the history, but disagrees just enough to prove it's independent, and it's all tied together by these subtle hidden threads.
So in the end, Paley leaves us with a question. What's more likely? That some ancient forger managed to create one of the most complex, subtle, and psychologically believable fakes in all of history? Or is it more likely that in these undesigned coincidences, these little accidents and telling differences, we're actually seeing the faint but unmistakable fingerprints of historical truth? It's something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.